Welcome to The Debate. When history looks back at the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, the camera lens is, well, it's almost exclusively focused on the American experience. We obsess over the Kennedy brothers, the blockade, the tension in the ex-com room, those 13 days where the world held its breath. But today, we are reversing that angle. We're looking at the man who actually set the dominoes in motion, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. The central inquiry for our discussion isn't how the crisis ended, but why it began in the first place. Was placing nuclear weapons in Cuba a rational strategic calculation to restore a broken balance of power? Or was it, as Western history so often paints it, a reckless gamble born of vanity and desperation?
It's really the ultimate Cold War question, isn't it? And frankly, the popular caricature of Khrushchev, the, shoe-banging, red-faced, erratic peasant, it really obscures the nuance of what was actually happening inside the Kremlin. I think when we really peel back the layers of the source material, we find that the why is, well, it's much messier than just grand strategy. I'm arguing that this decision wasn't purely about geopolitical chess. It was driven by severe internal Soviet pressures, specifically a crumbling economic promise and a desperate need for prestige. It was a gamble, and a dangerous one at that.
And I see why you gravitate toward the domestic chaos theory, but let me offer the counter-narrative. I believe the evidence shows Khrushchev's actions were a reasonable, even a necessary defensive measure. When you look at the board from Moscow's perspective, not Washington's, the USSR was encircled, and their key ally in the Americas was under immediate threat of annihilation. This wasn't a gamble. It was a rational attempt to protect a sovereign ally and restore a geopolitical balance of power that the United States had aggressively disrupted.
Well, that is certainly the charitable interpretation. It frames Khrushchev as a prudent guardian of the socialist sphere. But I suspect once we dig into the economic realities of the Soviet Union in 1962, that classic guns versus butter dilemma, that defensive posture starts to look a lot like a domestic budget cut masquerading as foreign policy. But let's get into the details.
Let's do it.
You take the floor first. Make the case for the rational strategist.
Gladly. To understand the why of 1962, you can't start in 1962. You have to look at the trauma of 1961. We have to talk about the Bay of Pigs. And the source material is pretty explicit on this point. After Fidel Castro's revolution in 1959, Cuba essentially defected from the American sphere to the Soviet one. The United States didn't just disapprove of this, they actively, militarily tried to reverse it. The Bay of Pigs invasion in April '61 failed, yes, but we have to look at what it signaled. It proved the U.S. was willing to use proxy military force to topple a sovereign government just 90 miles from its shore.
I don't dispute the invasion attempt happened or that it was a total fiasco for Kennedy. It certainly embarrassed the U.S.
It did more than embarrass them. It signaled intent. You have to weigh the psychological impact of that on Moscow. Khrushchev feared quite rationally that the USA would invade Cuba again. And he was right to worry. The Americans had launched Operation Mongoose, a covert program of sabotage and assassination attempts against Castro. Khrushchev knew the next time they came, they wouldn't just send 1,400 poorly equipped exiles. They would send the Marines, the Navy, the Air Force. In this context, placing missiles in Cuba was the only guarantee against a U.S. invasion. It introduces the core concept of deterrence. If you have nuclear assets on the island, the cost of invasion just becomes unacceptably high.
That's standard deterrence theory, sure. You make the prickly porcupine so the bear, or in this case the eagle, doesn't bite.
Exactly. But there's a second, maybe more critical layer to my position: the global context. We cannot ignore that the United States had already placed Jupiter nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy. These were medium-range ballistic missiles sitting right on the Soviet border. They could strike Moscow in minutes. Khrushchev believed, correctly, that this threatened Soviet security. By placing missiles in Cuba, he was simply adhering to the standards set by the Americans. He was placing the U.S. under a direct threat, similar to what the USSR faced every single day. It wasn't aggression, it was an attempt to restore symmetry.
I see the symmetry you're drawing. You did it to us, so we do it to you. It appeals to a sense of fairness. But I'm not convinced because it ignores the internal engine that was driving Soviet decision-making. While defense was a convenient justification to sell to the Presidium, the primary driver was, well, it was internal Soviet weakness, specifically regarding the military budget.
You think the most dangerous crisis in history was essentially an accountant's decision?
In many ways, yes. Look at the source material regarding Soviet military spending. The USSR was burdened by a large and expensive conventional army. We're talking about millions of men, thousands of tanks stationed all across Eastern Europe. That is an immense drain on an economy that was already struggling to provide consumer goods. Remember, Khrushchev had promised his people goulash communism. Better food, apartments, refrigerators. He couldn't deliver that lifestyle and maintain a massive standing army.
So this is the more bang for the ruble theory?
Precisely. Khrushchev's logic was fundamentally economic. He believed that nuclear weapons were cheaper than maintaining huge armies. A missile sits in a silo. It doesn't need to be fed or clothed or housed like a soldier. By placing missiles in Cuba, he hoped to rely on nuclear deterrence to justify slashing conventional military spending. If you have the ultimate weapon 90 miles from Florida, you don't need as many tank divisions in East Germany to feel secure. The source material notes he wanted to, quote, reduce spending on conventional forces. So I'd argue that this makes the move less about some noble balance of power and more about solving a domestic budget problem with a high-risk foreign policy solution. He was destabilizing the world to balance his checkbook.
That's a cynical take, though I would frame it differently. I think you're conflating efficiency with weakness. But let's move into the core debate, because I want to challenge this idea that the move was reckless. Let's look at the geography itself.
Please.
Let's talk about point 1, strategic necessity versus this idea of strategic advantage. You mentioned the missiles being 90 miles from Florida. I argue that proximity was essential for the defense of the revolution, not just an offensive threat. The source material highlights that Cuba was the only communist country in the Western Hemisphere.
The lonely outpost in a sea of capitalism?
Exactly. And that matters immensely. If Castro fell, it would damage the reputation of communism globally. It would signal to the Third World that the Soviet Union couldn't protect its friends. Khrushchev wanted to prove the USSR would defend communist allies. This wasn't just about saving Castro the man. It was about preserving the validity of their ideology in the Americas. When your ally is that close to your enemy, you need a shield that is equally close. The proximity wasn't a provocation. It was a necessity dictated by geography. Conventional troops couldn't get there fast enough, but missiles were already there.
I come at it from a different angle. You say shield, but the physics of a missile launch suggest a sword. We have to look at source point 5. It explicitly states that the missiles provided a strong bargaining position and the ability to strike U.S. cities quickly. That 90-mile statistic isn't just about defending Havana, it's about bypassing the American distant early warning systems.
But isn't that what deterrence is? Holding the other side hostage so they don't shoot?
There's a difference between a deterrent shield and an offensive posture designed to leverage the West. The source says this gave the USSR a strong bargaining position. That implies they intended to use these missiles as chips in a poker game, maybe to force the U.S. out of West Berlin, which had been a thorn in Khrushchev's side for years. That indicates an offensive posture. If the goal was purely to defend Castro, they could have stationed conventional troops, a tripwire force, or signed a mutual defense treaty. Placing offensive nuclear weapons that cut flight times to Washington, D.C. to under 15 minutes, that suggests they wanted a strategic military advantage to threaten the U.S., not just a defensive garrison.
I'm not sure I agree that a defense treaty or a few thousand Soviet infantry would have stopped a full-scale U.S. invasion in 1962. The disparity in conventional power in the Caribbean was just too vast. The U.S. Navy controlled those waters. A conventional defense was impossible. That's why the nuclear option was the only option for defense.
A defense that necessitates holding a knife to the throat of your opponent is indistinguishable from an attack preparation. And that ambiguity is exactly why it was such a gamble.
But let's pivot to the second point of contention, the rationality of the decision. You mentioned earlier that this was that gamble.
I would assert the rationality of the decision is based on reciprocity and the pursuit of equality.
Go on.
It is a fundamental principle of international relations. If the U.S. places missiles in Turkey, it is reasonable for the USSR to place missiles in Cuba. The source material notes that Khrushchev wanted the USSR to be seen as equal to the USA. This is vital context. The Soviet Union felt treated as a junior partner. The U.S. had ringed them with bases. If you treat me as a junior partner who can be encircled, I am unsafe. If I show I am your equal, if I can touch you just as you touch me, then we can coexist. It was a logical attempt to force the U.S. to treat the Soviet Union as a peer superpower. That is rational behavior.
That is where I have to push back. I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that it was purely about equality or rational parity. I think we have to talk about the prestige and status motivation mentioned in the material. It wasn't just about the state, it was about the man. The source notes it would enhance Khrushchev's personal reputation as a strong leader.
Leaders always care about their reputation. Kennedy certainly did. He was obsessed with not looking soft on communism.
True, but look at the stakes. Khrushchev was risking global nuclear war to satisfy a desire for status. He was under pressure from critics within the Kremlin who thought he was erratic, and from Mao Zedong in China who accused him of being weak and revisionist. The material says he wanted to show that communism could spread into the USA's sphere of influence. This smacks of vanity. It suggests the decision was driven by ideology and ego rather than prudent security planning. A rational actor does not risk the annihilation of their own country just to boost their personal reputation or to one-up the Chinese. That is the definition of a reckless gamble. He wanted the prestige of being the man who planted the red flag in America's backyard.
I think you're personalizing it too much. Prestige in the Cold War wasn't just vanity, it was currency. If you look weak, you get invaded. If you look weak, your allies defect. It's not about Khrushchev's ego, it's about the credibility of the Soviet deterrent. If the world thinks you're bluffing, your power just evaporates.
But there is a line between maintaining credibility and provoking a crisis you can't control. Khrushchev crossed that line. He believed he could pull off a masterstroke that would solve all his problems at once, silence his critics, save money, and scare the Americans. That is hubris, not strategy.
But let's look at your economic argument again, because I think there's a nuance there regarding military doctrine that we're missing. This brings us to point 3, the pivot from conventional to nuclear forces.
Right, the strategic shift.
You framed the shift to nuclear reliance as a sign of weakness and budget cuts. I would defend this shift as a modernization of military doctrine. Khrushchev wasn't just penny-pinching. He was, in his own way, a visionary in terms of military strategy. The source material says he believed nuclear weapons, not large armies, would decide future wars. And honestly, he was right.
How so?
He saw that the era of World War II-style mass mobilization was over. In the atomic age, having 5,000 tanks means nothing if a single missile can wipe them out. This was a forward-thinking strategic adjustment. By placing missiles in Cuba, he was operationalizing a modern military doctrine that prioritized high-tech deterrence over obsolete conventional mass. He was creating the strategic rocket forces. It wasn't just about cutting costs. It was about accepting the reality of the atomic age. He was trying to drag the Soviet military kicking and screaming into the future.
That's a compelling argument for his vision. But have you considered the stability or lack thereof of that pivot? Replacing stable, slow-moving conventional forces with high-stakes nuclear weapons in a volatile region like the Caribbean is incredibly dangerous.
Dangerous, perhaps, but illogical?
I'd argue it is illogical because it ignored the political fallout. He thought he could swap tanks for missiles, and the U.S. would just accept the modernization as a fait accompli. He failed to account for the political terror that nuclear weapons generate in a democracy. The cheaper option, the nuclear missiles, carried a price tag of existential risk. He was trying to get security on the cheap, and he ended up buying a crisis that almost destroyed the Soviet Union. He didn't understand that while missiles might be cheaper than tanks and rubles, they are infinitely more expensive in political risk. That is why I call it a gamble. He bet the farm on a budget-saving measure.
I think he bet the farm on the belief that the U.S. would act rationally and accept the new balance just as the Soviets had accepted the missiles in Turkey. He underestimated American political volatility in the impending U.S. election cycle. not the strategic logic itself. The logic held water. If the U.S. had accepted the missiles, the Soviet Union would have been secure and solvent.
If is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. A strategy that relies on your enemy accepting a gun to their head without flinching is a bad strategy. It assumes the other side is a computer, not a group of frightened human beings.
Or perhaps he simply miscalculated the method of delivery, the secrecy. If he had announced it openly, as a treaty, maybe the reaction would have been different. But we're drifting into what-ifs.
Or he overestimated his own cleverness. He thought he could sneak a nuclear arsenal across the Atlantic, an unprecedented logistical feat, to solve a domestic budget dispute and polish his ego. It was a harebrained scheme, to quote the colleagues who eventually ousted him.
We are approaching the end of our time, and as usual, we find ourselves staring at the same facts but seeing two very different pictures of the premiere.
It's the nature of the beast. History is rarely black and white.
To summarize my position, I believe the historical record shows that Khrushchev's actions, while undeniably high stakes, were a rational response to encirclement and aggression. You can't look at the missiles in Cuba without looking at the missiles in Turkey and the invasion at the Bay of Pigs. The goal was to protect an ally that was under threat and to achieve parity with the United States. The missiles were a logical tool for deterrence in a world where the Soviet Union was being backed into a corner by a superior nuclear power. It was, at its core, a defensive necessity.
And to summarize my perspective, I maintain that the decision was deeply flawed because it prioritized internal Soviet needs over global stability. Khrushchev was driven by a need to cut military spending to save a struggling economy and a desire to boost Soviet prestige and his own by engaging in a high-wire act in the Caribbean. The reasons were rooted in internal Soviet inefficiencies and a leader's need to appear strong against critics at home and in China, making it an aggressive gamble rather than a defensive necessity.
It is fascinating how the source material really does support both views. We have the deterrence and defense of an ally, clearly listed right alongside cutting spending and personal reputation.
It suggests that the reality, as always, is not binary. It wasn't just fear, and it wasn't just greed. It was a complex cocktail of both. Khrushchev was trying to secure the revolution abroad while securing his budget at home.
Indeed. Khrushchev was likely trying to solve 5 problems with one missile. Whether that makes him a strategic genius who overplayed his hand or a reckless gambler who got lucky is something our listeners will have to decide for themselves.
And thankfully, we are here to debate it rather than living in the smoking ruins of the alternative outcome.
A sobering thought to end on. Thank you for listening to The Debate. We'll see you next time.